So I think one thing that I mentioned this before, one thing that conservatives will accuse liberals and progressives about is sort of picking and choosing what they want to believe in the Bible, or kind of reinterpreting it in a very loose way.
Mm.
What do you think about claims like that?
I mean, so loose is a bit tricky because I mean there's a lot of scholarship that goes into these books and into a lot of these arguments at a detailed level. I think one of the things is there's a sort of there's a one of the assumptions that is different in how different Christians approach the Bible is there are some Christians who see the Bible as essentially univocal, that it says one thing and it doesn't have tensions or inconsistencies. And then there's a view that says this is 65 to 70 books written over the course of hundreds of years that contain internal disputes and debates, and that actually contains tensions and internal arguments that are going on throughout the centuries as different writers are conscious of earlier writers and are responding to and engaging with them in different ways. And if the Bible isn't a flat text, but is in fact a dynamic text that has these tensions in them, then you actually can't help but in some sense fall on a particular side of these tensions, or at least sit in the tensions. One of the challenges when people say, oh, you just pick and choose what you believe in the Bible, is they pretend as if you have any other choice. Like they pretend as if the text is sort of flat and has one perspective, and that it's just about accepting or rejecting that perspective, when actually it's a complex, multifaceted, text that draws on sources that are spread out over hundreds of years by multiple authors and different historical epochs with different theological perspectives, all in sort of arguments and conversation with each other, and speaking to different historical moments and audiences. And so it's not a flat text. And so you can't help but, in a sense, pick and choose or see how you fit into that open-ended and complex dynamic. It's sort of like, it's not about picking and choosing. It's about entering into the dialogue with the text as if the text was like a living conversation that we are a part of. The sort of arguments about picking, that people say, oh, I don't pick and choose, is an argument for, one, that the idea that the text is not a living word that the Spirit is still speaking to us through. It flattens the text, it cheapens the text, and it doesn't really tell the truth about how we in fact all interpret the text.
Yes, well, one of the responses that you see to, let's say, evident tensions between texts, certainly that you see in the New Testament, is attempts to reconcile differences between texts, to explain, well, when one scripture seems to say something different to another, or whether that's a narration of events or teaching of a doctrinal point, to develop an explanation as to how they're in fact in agreement. And this is something, well, I remember this as in the Mormon Church, because this is something that they sort of engage in, maybe to a lesser extent. And this is done both for apologetic and I think theological purposes. What do you think about that practice?
I mean, there are times when there are certain things that might, there are sometimes when tensions or seeming contradictions can be reconciled with a slightly stepped back, bigger framework for understanding how they work. But I think it's sort of misguided in a couple of ways, from my perspective. The first way I think it's a little bit misguided is I don't think most people are put off Christianity because an ancient text that we think is sacred, that was written by a bunch of different authors over hundreds of years, contains within it arguments amongst itself, that it's a record of conversation or argument. Like, it's not clear to me why that in itself is a problem for Christianity. Like, the history of the church is a history of conversations and arguments and disagreements, some of which are healthy, some of which aren't, some of which are really generative, and some of which are just sort of silly in hindsight. So the idea of that it's really important that people don't think the scripture has disagreements and tensions within itself is some sort of like foundational lodestar of Christian belief is just sort of not necessary or helpful. And the other thing is it's sort of, and so because it's not a necessary axiom, it then raises the question of like, a lot of the arguments then become unbelievable. They're like literally incredible. You know, like the kind of sort of simple one is like, did Judas hang himself or did he cut open his stomach? You know, like
Yeah.
what did he? You know, like it's sort of like what's and while we're spending all our time arguing about reconciling that, we could be inviting people into a much more sophisticated and complex and interesting community of practices and beliefs and ideas that actually is trying to do something about making the world more loving, more just, more full of mercy and hope and peace and joy. And we're not doing that because we're trying to convince people that this, you know, ancient multifaceted text is more boring. I don't really